Hello and welcome to today's webinar. We appreciate you spending the next 45 minutes with us. My name is Sochi and I will be your host. Please contact me with any assistance you need or questions you may have by typing into the chat box or sending an email to support@kit.org. Today's webinar is Creating a Sense of Belonging for Youth with Autism Spectrum Disorder. Your presenter today is Catherine King. Catherine has over 25 years of youth development experience in a variety of settings, including summer camp, after school, and teen programs. For the past 10 years, she has been providing coaching, training, and technical assistance to out-of-school time professionals in inclusive programs. As the business development manager, Catherine enjoys working closely with individuals, organizations, and systems to find the perfect blended learning approach to improve inclusive practices. Kat has a BS in Communication and Marketing from Virginia Tech and an MS in Recreation Administration from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Her articles and research have been published in Camping Magazine, Journal of Park and Recreation Administration, and Discovery Magazine. And with that, I turn it over to you, Kat.
Hello, welcome, and thank you everyone for joining us this evening. It's exciting to be here. Kids Included Together is thrilled to have started collaborating with For Inspiration and Recognition of Science and Technology. KID is working with First Leadership to identify and meet the disability inclusion and behavior support needs of youth on the teams that you work with, as well as to be a resource for volunteers and staff. And we really hope that you will consider KIT as your helpful guide on whatever your inclusion journey is. And I'm coming to you this evening from Apex, North Carolina, and it's so fun to see. We've got folks from Georgia, Montreal, New Hampshire, Texas, so please go ahead and keep putting in where you're from. I'm always excited to see how many different parts of the country and world are coming together to meet with us. So just to tell you a little bit more about this relationship between First and KIT. The goal of this partnership is to support teams in creating safe, positive, and inclusive environments and improving the overall experience for all youth. And the resources featured in the webinar today will be located on the First website along with a recording of this webinar, and that'll be happening just in the next day or so. And this evening I'm joined by some wonderful collaborators and colleagues. Sochi Martinez-Even will be hosting and providing tech support throughout this webinar. Neely Matthews, one of our KIT co-workers, will be communicating with you through chat box conversations if you're having questions. Shelley Henderson, the Director of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, is also with us this evening. She'll be answering questions throughout the webinar in the chat box and also will join us during the question and answer time. So as we're getting started, I just want to highlight why this webinar is relevant. Currently, 1 in 68 children have autism spectrum disorder. So chances are you know at least one youth with autism spectrum disorder participating in FIRST programs. And since ASD affects behavior, communication, and social skills, you might be wondering how you can help a youth with ASD in your FIRST program to connect with others and feel like they're a member of the group. So this workshop tonight is all about joining together to learn key information about how to create that sense of belonging for youth with ASD. And you're going to hear me throughout this webinar talk about autism, autism spectrum disorder, and ASD. And know that those are interchangeable terms. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in the next couple slides. And when you're finished with this webinar, you will be able to define autism spectrum disorder, explain why it can be difficult at times to create a sense of belonging for youth with ASD, and then be able to think through what could be a good accommodation to support a youth with ASD through a real-world first team scenario. And just for your information, what we have found to work really well with our webinars is for me to go through all of my slide deck, and I'm not going to answer any questions until the Q&A time at the end, but you can be typing questions in throughout this webinar and we'll keep track of them. And that's also something to think about. If you're not comfortable asking this in a group setting, you can definitely, when you do the post-webinar survey, ask me to respond and I will reach out to you personally. No matter where KIT trainers go, we are always asked about autism. So we're going to start with some basic facts. You may have heard the term autism, Asperger's, or high or low functioning autism and wonder what they mean, what the difference is. And autism, Asperger's syndrome, and pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified, also referred to as PDD-NOS, were all separate disorders. But then, in 2013, the American Psychiatric Association decided to group all of these disorders into one single diagnosis, and that's called Autism Spectrum Disorder, or ASD. And this change has been really interesting and sometimes controversial for families and youth, because there's a lot of identity wrapped up in the language we use. So it's important to recognize that even though the official medical diagnosis is now Autism Spectrum Disorder, some individuals may still refer to themselves as autistic or having Asperger's, and we want to respect their language preference. And we don't ever want to correct or tell people that they are using the wrong terminology. We want to honor the experience and the preference of individuals and families. ASD specifically impacts three things: social communication, social interaction, and behavior. And this could include things like understanding social emotional situations. Maybe a youth might have difficulty understanding the use of nonverbal cues for social interaction. You might have a youth who has difficulty reading those body language and social cues to see if a peer is or isn't interested in partnering on a project task, or when it's time to wrap up a conversation. Another challenge may be around developing a relationship, such as really knowing who's receptive to engaging and interacting and who is not interested. Another key challenge might be around sensory processing. And I'm sure you have seen at tournaments or other events where a youth looks like they might be overwhelmed by the loud and busy tournament spaces. A youth with ASD may not be as comfortable in those large venues with a lot of movement, a lot of bodies, and might require a few more supports because of those sensory processing difficulties. And it's important to remember that these skills are on a spectrum, and recognize that what might work for one youth with ASD might not work with someone else. So for example, you might have a youth with ASD who is nonverbal but is very adept at reading social cues, and then have another first team member who is very, very fluent in reciting rules but is unable to have a back and forth conversation with a peer. So just as with every other youth, we want to recognize individual strengths and needs, that a youth with ASD is not any different than anyone else on a team. And in a moment, we're going to talk about some examples of what these skills might look like in FIRST. But before we do that, I'd like to take a quick poll. And I want to make sure that we're all on the same page with the definition of autism spectrum disorder. So if you could use your little cursor and select which definition you believe is correct for autism spectrum disorder. Is it the first one? ASD is a disability in which all youth have the same set of skills. Is it the second one? A group of disorders that impact communication and behavior. Number 3, a single disorder that impacts communication, interaction, and behavior. Or the last choice, a disability that causes children to fear interactions. And I'm going to give you about 20 more seconds to think that through, and then I will follow up. All right, look at that. So no one picked the first option. A few people, 2 picked the second, and then 8 picked the third, and no one picked the fourth. And I can definitely see where that second one might be a little confusing. Number 3, that third one, is the correct answer because autism spectrum disorder is one single diagnosis, and it affects social communication, social interaction, and behavior. So great job, everyone. Okay, so now let's take a look at some of the behaviors or characteristics that you might see in a first team or at a first event related to a youth with autism spectrum disorder. So I'm going to go through each one of these in a little bit more detail. And the first one I'm going to start with is avoiding groups. And this might look like a youth walking around the outside of a room, not making eye contact, looking like they don't want to be part of the group. But we'll talk in a moment about why we don't want to make that assumption, because that might be incorrect. The next one is looking away while listening. Not making eye contact, but it is possible and more than likely probable that that youth is paying attention. And I don't know about you, but there are definitely times when I'm listening intently, and in order to focus 100% on what's being said, I might look up to the corner of the room or look down, and that's actually helping me to focus. The next behavior is echoing words. And I've worked with youth who always repeat the last sentence or last few words. I've also worked with youth who communicate only by using lines from Disney movies that seem to come out of nowhere. And it took us a little time to figure out what he was referencing, but then we actually were able to have conversations through that shared language, through those Disney movies, which was kind of cool. Next is making repetitive movements. I have seen youth with ASD flap their hands when they're excited, or perhaps jerk back a little bit every now and then. Another one is playing with the same objects, using the same materials over and over again. You may have a youth in the first Lego League Junior or first Lego League that wants to start out by using the same Lego pieces or creating the same shape as a warm-up. I worked with a young man in aquatics program, and he was fine as long as he always had the same green life jacket every time. That routine and having that consistency with that object really made a difference for him. Another behavior is spinning objects, and we're going to talk about the reason behind that in just a moment. Making noises. And I've supported youth who have used clicking sounds or other noises to communicate, but not using words, but by knowing what those noises are and being familiar with them, they are actually a fairly accurate way to communicate their needs and wants. Next up is avoiding or seeking sensory input, such as touch or sound or movement. You may have youth that have difficulty managing environments when they are very loud and want to go to the quietest part of the room. And then you might have the flip where you have youth who crave the loud noise or crave more sensory input, might bump into other people. I worked with a youth at a summer camp who could tolerate noisy assembly time as long as someone had this plastic back massager that was rolled up and down his back every now and then, and that's what helped him. But as you can see, all of these behaviors or preferences can affect how a first team member interacts with others and the activities that you offer at first. So this can also affect the perception that others may have about the member. So let's dig a little deeper into that. One challenge that we as adults supporting youth development face when we're working with youth with ASD is understanding the meaning behind the behavior. Based on the behaviors we just discussed, we might assume youth with the ASD aren't understanding or interested in activities, forming relationships, or being an integral part of the team. And again, this could be a logical conclusion when you see a youth with ASD walking around the room, seeming not to pay attention to what others are doing. They look disinterested or like they want to avoid the activity. But it is so important to remember that we do not know what someone else is thinking, feeling, or experiencing. We can't pop into someone else's mind to see what they want. We need to take the time to think about what the behaviors truly mean and not make assumptions. We need to discover the message that that first team member is trying to communicate. And let's look at one person's experience to better understand the meaning behind one type of behavior. You may have heard of the woman Temple Grandin. And Dr. Grandin is a renowned speaker, also a scientist, and a professor of animal science, to be specific. She also has autism. And she says, "I was intensely preoccupied with the movement of the spinning coin or lid, and I saw nothing and heard nothing. I did it because it shut out sound that hurt my ears. No sound intruded on my fixation. It was like being deaf. Even a sudden noise didn't startle me out of my world." The spinning she describes and the repetitive behaviors of spinning that coin and those noises we mentioned a few moments ago, those are referred to as stimming. In the past, researchers believed those behaviors had no purpose and had to be stopped. And I remember years ago in grad school, I was working with middle school students with ASD in an after-school program, and I was told by therapists that I needed to stop the stimming behavior because they were retreating from the real world, and stopping it would bring them back. But newer research reveals that these behaviors are a coping mechanism and indicate that a youth may be experiencing something uncomfortable, perhaps in the environment, just like Dr. Temple Grandin describes, or else struggling to figure out how to communicate. These behaviors can feel paralyzing, and they can also be isolating because they might be perceived as, quote unquote, weird to other kids and interpreted as the person being uninterested in the program and withdrawing. That's one type of behavior that can create distance between youth with ASD and their peers. Some youth rock, some hum or make loud noises, others spin objects. We need to reflect on what might be happening to cause the discomfort and figure out if there are ways to make changes to the environment or the expectations which then might lessen that stimming behavior. There's a huge consequence to misinterpreting what youth with ASD may or may not be able to do based on their behavior. It can lead to creating distance rather than creating that sense of belonging. Knowing that ASD impacts communication, interaction, and behavior, we can see that it might be difficult for first staff, coaches, mentors, volunteers, everyone to help create that sense of belonging. But it is not impossible. And we've heard stories at different first events where youth on the autism spectrum are stars of their teams. If we can pay attention to things like the body language, that can be a key to identifying what that member needs to be more comfortable and become a true member of that group. So in a moment, we're going to talk about some strategies that you can use to help create that sense of belonging, and can also be especially effective, especially effective for youth with ASD. But first, I'd like to open up the chat box and hear your thoughts on what we've just discussed. So I'd like to take a couple minutes using the chat box, type in your explanation for why it can be difficult to create a sense of belonging for youth with ASD in your first programs. So I'm going to stay quiet and let you type in for a few minutes. All right, so we have a comment from someone who says, "Hi everyone, sometimes we simply do not know initially that a youth is with ASD." Right, so actually you may not really even need to know that a youth is on the autism spectrum. What you need to know are what accommodations are helpful and what that youth needs to be successful. So, don't get too hung up on whether or not you know an actual diagnosis, but do know it's important to find out as early as possible in either the registration process or in conversations with families, past experience, what this youth might need in terms of communication supports or social emotional supports. Another person writes, "A sense of belonging requires the student to feel understood and a part of the group. Students with ASD have a hard time interacting, and that makes other students and parents around them uncomfortable, which makes them uncomfortable and inhibits building a sense of belonging." Right, and one of the best things we can do as adults is model that level of comfort and accept if you do see stimming behaviors that's just part of Mike figuring things out and not getting really upset or concerned. Another person said, "Most of my teams have handled their ASD members well internally, but have a difficult time explaining to the judges why a member might wander the room or not pay attention during the session. They are uncomfortable calling out the team member even though they have been working with the teammate all season." Okay, so one sense of belonging that might be difficult is in that tournament or competition setting where people who don't know that youth might treat them differently or may not know the backstory, so may not know how to act, or in the case of the judges, know how they're supposed to judge in a way that's considered a reasonable accommodation. Okay, Another comment is, from my understanding of what I am hearing and from my recollections from last season, some of the very things about a competition may be those very things which make an ASD youth uncomfortable. It is very important for the mentors to be acutely aware of their team's strengths, weaknesses, and needs. Beautifully said, and what a great segue. So we're going to shift and talk about what some of the ways you can be aware of those strengths and needs are. One final comment, someone said, too many people and activities could all be going on at the same time, making it too hard to focus. So wonderful. Thank you so much for all of those comments. So going back to the statement someone said about being aware of each teammate's strengths, weaknesses, and needs, I want to share with you an excellent resource Kit has created called a case-by-case checklist. And you can use this to gather information about a member's needs, be able to store it in one place, and communicate it with those staff supporting and working with the youth. And having that need-to-know basis is clearly important. But with this case-by-case checklist, you are able to look at strengths and interests, areas of support, accommodations, ways that you can comfort, provide calming items, and so forth. And this case-by-case checklist will be uploaded to the First Inspire's website along with a recording of this webinar within the next couple of days, so you can access this on your own. So you can use this to match the youth's needs with accommodations. Remember to always speak with the family about what they have found to be helpful and ask their permission to speak with the youth school day teacher or if there are therapists involved before having those discussions. We're now going to review some strategies that we at KIT have found to be really successful in including youth with ASD and providing supports for them. And I'm going to explain these tangible tools and ways of interacting in terms of visuals, rhythms, and facts. And I love using visuals for all youth, but they have been especially successful for youth with ASD. They're so helpful to process information, especially if verbal information is difficult for that member to process. One type of visual is a visual schedule, and that shows what will be happening during the team meetings or the tournaments or expos throughout a set period of time. And we recommend using words and pictures. If it's during team meetings, you can hang it somewhere that everyone can access. It may be on a wall or on a door, but you can also create smaller portable versions that you can keep on a clipboard or on a backpack to carry from location to location in a competition venue. And those pictures are really important, not just having words. So you can do a few different sizes and options. I've used schedules the size of bookmarks. I've even put schedules inside of a neoprene cuff like football players use to look at football plays so that the schedule can be referred to without having to take up a bunch of time, having it really closely accessible. And one key is to have the ability to change the schedule as needed. So if part of your team meeting time is going to be in the outside and suddenly it's raining, you want to be able to change up that schedule to show that now you're going to the garage or to a different location in a house or a classroom. And there's a great resource called Connectability where you can make these free visuals. I highly recommend using this resource. You can take pictures of your own environment and upload them onto the Connectability site, or you can use their library of pictures and drawings. And then they've got ready-made templates so you can insert all of these pictures. And that reference will be in the resource section that I'll share at the end of this webinar. Another category of visual that you can use is called sequencing cards, used to break down tasks. And here is a step-by-step visual detailing a shower routine. And so you can use this same concept for other routines or other tasks. So you see this young woman who's got a drill. You could have a routine for how to set up the drill and then specific tasks that the drill is going to be used to accomplish. And I searched high and low and could not find a sequence visual that is specific to FIRST. So I'm going to put this out there right now. If you have a sequence card that's a visual that you would like to share with me, if you send it to me at my email address, and I'm going to share that with you at the end of the webinar, I will in return send you a little thank you in the mail for providing that resource to me. But for youth with ASD or having trouble processing verbal language, that breaking down of an activity into pictures can really be the difference between participation and non-participation and that level of participation. And so then that will lead into opportunities for social interaction and that sense of belonging. The next category I want to talk to you about is rhythms. I once worked with a youth with autism who often seemed like he was in his own world. And one day I was helping him clean up, and I don't know why, but for some reason I used this really sing-songy voice and said, "Thank you, thank you, thank you." And it was like he woke up when he heard that. And we found that music or rhythmic voices was the key to connecting with him. And Dr. Grandin often talks about pattern thinkers who respond well to music and patterns that can be found with rhythms. So think about how you could include those rhythms in your FIRST team or providing support for a FIRST team. When I was a summer camp and after-school director, we used rhythmic callbacks as a way to get the group's attention and individual youth's attention. So things like, when I say rock, you say solid, rock, solid, rock, solid. And these callbacks can be creative. They could be related to very FIRST specific themes. There was a youth director that I knew who had the funniest, silliest callbacks. One I remember was he'd yell, "I like my daddy's records," and the kids yelled back, "This house ain't got no smell." And he had probably 3 dozen of these random callbacks, but everyone knew them, everyone loved them, and they looked forward to coming back and having a chance to yell back those callbacks. The next way that we could provide support is thinking about something that youth with autism are often interested in, that's facts. And I had a coworker who knew a young adult with ASD in college, and the facts he was most interested in related to the bus schedules. He could tell you where to transfer to get to where you needed to go, what time the bus was going to come for the entire city of Baltimore. And his fellow students were very respectful. They didn't try to test his knowledge or make him embarrassed about his skill. They actually considered him a resource that was valuable and sought out his knowledge. And that, for him, created a sense of belonging. And you can do the same thing in your program. For example, if you have a youth with ASD who knows a lot about trains, you could organize a building activity to create a miniature train and let that youth be the expert to talk about how to create and design that train. The key will be recognizing the kinds of knowledge that could be a strength and use that to create leadership and social opportunities. So I'm going to open up the chat box again. And if you have a particular story or an example you would like to share where youth were very knowledgeable about facts, and that was used to create a leadership or social opportunity, go ahead and type it in now, and I'll read those out. But in the meantime, I want to share with you a story of two youth that I had in my program. They were brothers, Joey and Jason, and they were weather gurus. And they would, every day, as part of my after-school assembly, come up and give a weather report the next day. So we created a box of outfits, and they would go to this skip box and pull out whatever outfit would be appropriate for that weather. So a raincoat and umbrella if it was going to rain the next day, or if it was really cold, hats, gloves, and a coat. And they loved using the microphone, talking about all the different aspects of the weather. And what was really cool about this is other kids started asking if they could help give the weather report. So it was a social opportunity. They picked different kids to come up and help them give the weather report, and it worked out beautifully. So I'm not seeing any comments of examples that you have seen in your first teams or in programs you've worked with. So I'm going to move on. And I wanted to take a slide to really focus on the importance of the environment as a consideration for youth with ASD. For example, we talked earlier how sensory seeking or sensory avoiding might be one of the behaviors seen for youth with ASD. So if you know that a loud, busy environment like a tournament venue or an expo venue could be a trigger for challenging behavior or sensory needs, you may want to plan to have noise reduction headphones available. At a recent first event that Kit was at, we had a regional director share that she created a quiet room that was available at all of her tournaments, and that quiet room actually ended up being really popular as a place not just for youth with ASD, but for other participants, spectators, judges, coaches who were overwhelmed by the environment and really wanted that quiet space. So it was universally appreciated. I would also recommend taking a look at the spaces where you have your team meetings and figure out, is there a place you could create a quiet space where someone could go if they feel overwhelmed. And I want to stress it's not a timeout, and it's not a place for kids to go if they're not feeling well. It's a place where youth can self-select to go when they need a break, either from the environment or to just think things through for a little bit in a quieter space. And think about items that would be enjoyable for that youth in the space. Headphones with music, books or magazines, sketch pads and pencils. Okay, so now let's actually think through a scenario. So I'm going to read out a scenario, and I want you to think through what strategies you could use to support this first team member. So this is 10-year-old Sean, and he isn't sure what to do during transition times at first team meetings. He may stand near the window or wander to another part of the room. If he does take his turn to work on a robotics activity, he sometimes uses tools incorrectly. So what strategies could you use to support Sean? And I'm just going to stay quiet if you want to think through what might be helpful. Either something we've discussed previously in this webinar or a fresh idea that you have. All right, so we've got visual guides, visual schedules, visual sequencing. Okay, so maybe having those steps during the transition to show the steps of what he needs to do and in what order, or maybe having some choice visuals. You can do one of three things. Which one would you like to do? Someone else said, looks like Sean could use a schedule for team meetings. All right, here's a great one. Knowing in advance what interests him. So it could be he really loves red Legos. So you want to have red Legos, or a particular robotics component. You'd want to make sure to have that he could hold in his hand or interact with while he's waiting for something to start, or perhaps ask a friend to do with him. Okay, great. So just to recap, ASD impacts social communication, social interaction, and behavior. Our job is to figure out the meaning behind the behavior and to consider using visuals, rhythms, and facts to support youth with ASD. These are some resources that are available to you very easily, either through websites, or these might be books that you could purchase on Amazon.com or get from the library. And once again, when we upload this webinar, we'll also upload the slides, so you'll have this information on firstinspires.org. If you're thinking about what next steps would be helpful, I recommend, first off, observing the youth with ASD in your program. See what is their spectrum of skills. Do they use any stimming behaviors? What might that behavior be communicating? What strategies might be a good fit? Think that through. Talk with the family. Talk with the youth, him or herself. Also observe the environment. Is there anything you can adjust to make it more comfortable? If a quiet space is helpful, where could you create that? It might be just a corner of the existing room, but where could you put that in place as a support? All right, so now we are to our question and answer time. And you've been very patient and very interactive. I wish I was able to follow everything going on in the chat box. We have 3 questions that have been identified, and so I'll read through those. But if you have questions you want to type in now, feel free to type them in. We have a couple minutes. The first question is, actually it's more of a comment, saying that he received a Monarch Old Dominion University magazine, Volume 8, Number 1, Spring 2018, and it has a very interesting 4-page article on autism spectrum disorder. Thank you so much, Kevin, for sharing that. We will make sure to add that to our list of resources and read that. I look forward to that. Old Dominion University, that's in Virginia, right? ODU? And then a few people have mentioned that you have not been part of an organization that has an individual with autism spectrum disorder. So thank you for sharing that. And now you will be very prepared if you are in that situation in the future. So please go ahead and type into the chat box if you have any questions. It's very quiet out there. I'll give you about 30 more seconds to type a question that you have in. And before we wrap up, I'd also like to remind you, please fill out the post-webinar survey that will pop up when you leave this webinar, because we would love to hear what other topics you would like first to present related to disability inclusion, maybe behavior support in general, or other areas of equity, diversity, and inclusion. All right, people are saying thank you. This was informative and amazing. Excited about the collaboration. Kit is also excited about this collaboration. So now here's a little bit more information. My email address and phone number is listed on the right side of the screen, Catherine@kit.org. my phone number. And a General Kit phone number is also listed, General Kit email address. And then our website is www.kit.org. We have many resources on our kit.org website. We have an online learning center that many of you, if you are an equity ally or equity influencer, you have been given a Kit Pass to start accessing webinars just like this one and many others. We have an inclusion support center where we can do calls by phone that can be child specific, and we also can package resources as well. So I'm going to turn it over to Sochi, who's just going to wrap us up.
Thank you, Kat. We would also love to stay connected with you via our social media. So here are the channels for our Facebook, Twitter, and Pinterest accounts. We appreciate you spending some of your time with us today, and we hope that you took away many great tips and tools to bring to your program. Remember, KIT is here as a partner and a resource, so please reach out with any way we can assist you. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you, Kat.
All right. Thank you very much. Take care, everyone.